I would like to show my respect and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which the Bentley campus is located. As a representative of Curtin University, I am proud to honour the Noongar people and value this place of shared learning. I recognise the impact of the past and, as an active participant in reconciliation, I am committed to a future of mutual honour and respect. Today I'm going to discuss the ways in which stereotypical media representations of Indigenous Australians lead to racism and othering. Holiday, Hyde and Kuhlman define othering as imagining someone as alien or different to us in such a way that they are excluded from our normal, superior and civilized group. The Indigenous filmmaker Frances Peters Little argues that television portrayals of Indigenous people are divided into nobles or savages. The mainstream news media tends to portray the negative stereotype of the savage, focusing on Indigenous criminality, while advertising and documentaries tend to portray the more positive but nonetheless essentialist stereotype of the noble Indigenous Australian, depicting them in more traditionalist roles, activities and dress. Peters Little notes that it is as if the dominant stories about Aborigines in the north are noble stories, while stories about Aborigines in the southeast are stories about Aborigines who are savage and belligerent. It is the tendency of nature and wildlife documentaries to portray the noble stereotype of Indigenous Australian. Programs such as Walkabout and Nature Walkabout showed Indigenous Australians living in harmony with nature. Such documentaries uphold essentialist notions that real Aborigines have a natural affinity to the land, with little need for anything that exists in the modern world. In advertising, the noble stereotype of Indigenous Australians is the one generally portrayed. A study of 100,000 seconds of Australian advertising found that the only Indigenous Australians pictured were children with painted faces. This romanticised view, often exacerbated by so-called white guilt, is essentialist and othering. The view is that Indigenous Australians are somehow nobler than whites, and that before colonisation they enjoyed, as one noted intellectual put it, a lost, enchanted world, leavened by playfulness, joy and humour, soaked in magic, sorcery, mystery and ritual, pregnant at every moment with deep and unquestioned meaning. According to academic David Hollingsworth, the problem with media representation of Indigenous Australians is not so much underrepresentation as it is representation within racist frameworks. While there are gaps in the representation of Indigenous Australians in drama and comedy, for example, they are overrepresented in news and current affairs. The portrayal of Indigenous criminality is a well-documented tendency in the mainstream news media. Studies of newspaper references to Indigenous people have shown that the outstanding central issue is the Indigenous and the justice system. Also, content reviews of mass media have found that the race of criminal offenders is mentioned more often when the offenders are Indigenous. Common stereotypic representations include stories of criminality, drunkenness, poor health, welfare dependency, and family violence. A survey of the Sydney Morning Herald from January 1987 to April 1990 found that 40% of the Australian-based usage of the word riot referred to Aboriginal people. In 1991, a Perth journalist conceded to Royal Commissioner Elliot Johnson that racial stereotyping and racism in the media is institutional. A story featuring Aboriginals is simply more likely to be covered. The National Inquiry into Racist Violence in 1991 concluded that the Australian media perpetuated negative racial stereotypes, a tendency towards conflictual and sensationalist reporting on race issues, and an insensitivity towards and often ignorance of minority cultures, which could contribute to a social climate which is tolerant of racist violence. The Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody also concluded that negative media portrayals of Indigenous people were a major cause of racism in Australia. The Commission illustrated the danger of stereotypes when it was found that some of those whose deaths were investigated were placed in custody because they were assumed to be drunk, when in fact they were in need of medical assistance. Frances Peters-Little highlights the way in which media representations of Indigenous people lead to othering when she notes that representations of Indigenous people are often confined to a political or cultural context. Rarely do we see them in kitchens or in public places like coffee shops and supermarkets, going to work in their offices or in the ordinariness of the day. Black people or brown people supposedly do not occupy the same public sphere as white people. Neither the noble nor the savage stereotype of Indigenous Australians is truly representative. People are people. Indigenous Australians are not perfect specimens of humanity left over from an innocent past, nor are they all drunken criminal doll-dodgers. When the media continues to stereotype Indigenous Australians as being either noble or savage, they are perpetuating essentialist notions by presuming a universal essence, homogeneity, and unity in Indigenous culture. As Kay Bullimore puts it in Media Dreaming, Representation of Aboriginality in Modern Australian Media, the media fails to portray Aborigines in a manner which reflects the kaleidoscopic nature of Aboriginal identity. Until the media begins to represent Indigenous Australians in a non-stereotypical way, othering and racism towards them will continue. Thank you for listening.